Logan, who knew that Ken Burns would be such a powder keg of a topic? Who would have thought? Who would have thought?
Who'd have thunk?
That we would spark the discussion that we did when we had the purposely engaging and
Provocative is the word you're looking for.
Provocative title of "Is Ken Burns Actually Good?" Who knew that would get history buffs riled up? We did.
No one could have seen it coming.
That's why we wrote it that way.
Oh. Well, Sam, you're right. A fire is sweeping across the nation right now, and it is debate about Ken Burns as a filmmaker and storyteller. After we last week did a little review of episode 1 of his Civil War series. We'll be continuing that review later in this episode. But first, Sam, I think we want to take a look at a little bit of the discussion that has swept the United States of America.
Absolutely. So I am Sam Temple. With me is Logan Ledman. We make up the 1855 history team. And our primary audience base is on Facebook. And, you know, we have stuff on YouTube, and obviously you're listening to this on whatever your favorite podcast app is. But our primary audience is on Facebook. By the time this goes out, we'll have, 7,000 likes and stuff. We have 7,000 followers today, by the way. Woohoo, that's exciting. Yeah, so we've been telling stories for 6 years through documentaries, through social media engagement, and now through podcasts. And the way that Facebook works, we get a lot of our audience by sharing into these either private or public Facebook groups, because that's where a lot of people with mutual interests like history or specifically the Civil War can share interesting discussions, photographs, or just toss some opinions around. So we have several comment sections that we're going to go through. The first is going to be the comments directly on our page's post. And then I'll be going through the posts that were shared into different groups by myself and see some of the comments from the diehard Civil War buffs. So Logan, what are the goodies we've got from our own Facebook page?
Yeah, I mean, we had a good range of opinions on our original post. I would say good opinions all around. A pretty positive feedback on the question, is Ken Burns actually good? One person summed it up. Michael said, he is great, which was generally a pretty blunt and efficient description of what most people said. Now, there was some interesting debate about what being good actually means. What is it expected that someone in Ken Burns' line of work should do? Ronnie said a TV historical miniseries is intended as a gateway to the subject matter, and it doesn't replace true scholarship and research, which is a good point. It's a question about what is the responsibility of a documentary filmmaker. Is it to introduce people to a subject, to encourage them to do further research? And if so, do they not have to necessarily follow the same guidelines as a researcher? Do they get a little bit more maybe artistic license? JR in response said, I don't think Ken Burns is necessarily a scholar or a researcher, but that he works with lots of prominent scholars and researchers. Ronnie responded with, he's primarily a personality, not an intellectual, kind of wondering what the role of Ken Burns himself actually is within this project. JR agreed with Ronnie and said he has a different job than professional historians have. And quoting JR, I think he does that job very well by working with some of the most highly regarded historians. I think his work is complementary to theirs and encourages further scholarship. And finally, Ronnie finished up that conversation by saying Ken Burns is a legend in his field, and all Civil War enthusiasts owe him a debt of gratitude. So certainly there's this debate about if you want to say that Ken Burns is good or great or bad at his job, you have to define what his actual role is. Is he a historian? Is he a storyteller? some people called him a filmmaker. Some people call him a historian. Um, James says he has a style, and it shows through every series, and maybe that's what he is more than anything else. Is kind of one of the threads that pops up in just the original post itself. Is that really the Ken Burns style and framework and personality is what's consistent across his work and what makes it, in these people's opinions, great. You can't compare it directly to a historian's scholarly work, is how James put it.
Right.
And I think so. So that's where the conversation started organically on our page. And Sam, I haven't. You shared it to a number of pages that I do not have access to. A number of pages that I've been banned from, or I've never been invited to. Sam,
you're too much for these Civil War groups.
That's right. Sam is.
You're just too wacky. They can't handle
pages, and he shared them far and wide. So Sam, let's expose me to some of the great conversations that have been happening.
That's right, and actually, that's why you were banned by these pages. You were exposed to stupid. Okay.
Nice. Great.
The implication was that you exposed yourself to the Facebook groups. It's definitely not just because you haven't requested to join any of them. Definitely not that. I just don't want to be talked too flippantly about this, and then you get the. I would love that if you just people are just super hush hush about. Oh, Logan, he don't talk about the Civil War Facebook groups with him. He's got history. No, but one of the groups really went off of a lot of the stuff that you brought up there, and primarily what is his job? Is his job just to get people interested to learn more in the history? A couple people said they enjoyed what they call the untainted nature of the first-hand accounts. We've talked about the responsibility of using primary sources. It's been called detailed and informative. From this particular group, my favorite comment is, I think there's got to be at least 20 O's in this. Boring movies. This is from Adam. Adam says his Civil War documentary did far more harm to learning the Civil War in my school than anything else. So boring. I could see it putting everyone, including me, to sleep, and I still stand by it.
That's actually asked, that's another question of is part of his job entertaining middle schoolers? Like, is that
right?
Or that's not necessarily what he was trying to accomplish in this series. Should it have been? Is it a failure if it's not engaging to ninth graders in at 10 a.m. in a public school? It's an interesting question. What else?
And especially now, you could make because of the work that Ken Burns has done, you could do so much more. Okay, this documentary series is geared toward the Civil War buffs, the people that know the different beats of the war. They know the different battles. This is for the hardcore. This is more for the noobs. Ken Burns, since he was doing that work, wouldn't have necessarily had as many hardcore people. At least it wouldn't be as accessible, because prior to these being on public television, you weren't, unless you had hours to pour over books and things. And you had the literacy, the time, and the interest. Television engaged a lot of people in a lot of new subjects.
Yeah.
So that can't be denied. And this Civil War documentary definitely would have been a lot of people's introductions. But that's the primary takeaway from this group. The other group, though, has 55 comments.
Wow.
And we're not going to be able to get into a lot of this. But contemporary politics gets into it here.
Really?
There are people who thought that Ken Burns' approach was too right-leaning. Other people thought it was too left-leaning.
Interesting.
It was really interesting, and Timothy brought up. I always enjoy Ken Burns' work, but I will say I am curiously a bit depressed after watching any of his series. The music and narration is a bit of a dirge. His baseball series spends way too much time on racism, like we're watching history couched in 20th century leftism. Again, I do enjoy his work even through these criticisms, and that I thought was an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Um, uh, uh, John brings up Burns, I see as a grand storyteller. People on the right will say he only talks about racism, and people on the left can point to the fact that he encouraged the lost cause narrative in 1990. He just goes to the more interesting story regardless where it leads him. And that again goes back to the argument of what's the responsibility of the documentarian. And honestly, I think that's something that history communicators all across, like of all mediums, have to deal with. Is pursuing interesting stories. And again, we've talked about this last week, is what is our responsibility? How could someone misuse what we're presenting? How could someone misconstrue what we're presenting? And you mentioned JR in some of our comments, and JR also commented in this group, and it went back and forth there. And one individual said, while his documentaries are well made, Burns' left-leaning is apparent in everyone I've watched. He focuses so much on racism. And later on he says, while I agree that racism has and still exists, its story must be told, within our current atmosphere in this country, Burns' coverage of it seems like a subtle way of pushing the 1619 Project. While modern-day activists browbeat their message to you, Burns uses a more gentle way of getting his message across. JR, as the response of the 1619 Project came out in 2019, Burns has been a filmmaker since the 1980s. And she says that Nicole Hannah-Jones is 23 years younger than Ken Burns. If anything, the 1619 Project was almost certainly influenced by Burns' work much more than the other way around. And the original commenter said they understood that, but the point is, they say, Ken Burns pushes the same lesson as the 1619 Project. That is that America was built on the backs of slaves and that white Americans are inherently racist. I would push back on Kevin just that I haven't been getting that almost at all from these first two episodes of the series.
Yeah.
And JR goes much more into a summary of what systemic racism is, what generational stratification is, and to the extent that slave labor was essential to the founding of America. And JR says that doesn't necessarily make all white Americans inherently racist. A person can be someone who professes anti-racism and yet does or says racist things from time to time. I'm sure Ken Burns has probably done or said racist things in the past. Most of us have. Also, most of us don't do those things all the time, and a lot of us improve our speech and behavior when prompted or when we learn new things. I'd like to push back on the idea that the 1619 Project and Burns' work promotes the idea that all white people are inherently racist. Where does the work say that, or what about the work suggests that it professes that idea? So this opens up a lot of conversations. Again, because the Civil War is such a seminal moment, Ken Burns' documentary work is so critical to the modern historiography of the war,
right,
that this touches on a lot of subjects that is broad-reaching. And those are maybe like 6 comments of 55 on this post. I'm going to scroll through. Logan, maybe you have some thoughts in response to that conversation between Kevin and JR, if you have.
Yeah, it's interesting because the question of ideological leanings in a documentarian goes back to that question of what the role of Ken Burns is and what his responsibilities should be. Is it the role of a filmmaker or storyteller to be objective? Is it their role to be transparent, to be persuasive? If it is not their job to be a academic historian, then do they have the freedom to operate from an ideological lens? I am not really convinced that Ken Burns is approaching the Civil War from a dogmatically leftist perspective in this series so far. Certainly not from like a Marxist perspective or something like that. Uh, I guess he certainly talks about institutional, forms of discrimination, like slavery, obviously, and he takes a somewhat he takes a especially for 1990 a pretty active role in using primary sources from people like Frederick Douglass. So there's that, but I wouldn't call that kind of action specifically ideologically biased towards like a towards leftism or something. I don't really that's more of an imposition of current day like cultural signifiers than it is an actual like discussion of political values or something like that. It, in my opinion, and there's the fact that if discussing racism is somehow a leftist thing to do, then Ken Burns doesn't even really do it that much in the first two episodes that we've done. Certainly in the first episode, it's pretty good. But in the second one, Sam, you and I talked a little bit before starting this recording, and Barbara Fields from the first episode, who talked about slavery a few times. She's a really incredible historian and theorist of race. Her book Racecraft from 2012 is really incredible, and so she was brought on to speak a little bit about slavery in the first episode, and she didn't show up at all in this one. I think Shelby Foote was pretty much the only historian in this episode.
I believe he was the only historian in this episode. Yes.
Yeah. So it's as Shelby Foote is by no means like he's not exactly a Marxist Leninist or something, like it's
no, he mostly comes in to talk about Southern anecdotes in this episode.
Yeah. So that is the least objective part of the documentary. Is he's pretty clear that he's interviewing a person who has their own views and opinions and thoughts on the Civil War, bringing this person
and
Shelby
who
Foote.
He chose.
Yeah.
Who Ken Burns chose to include,
Yeah.
It is an active choice. Obviously, Ken Burns is not controlling what an interviewee says.
Yeah.
But they're certainly deciding what part of the interview to include. So that's most of what the comments are. Some people thought that Ken Burns' piece is, quaint and outdated today. Someone said, if you think Ken Burns' Civil War is outdated, it's because you're pushing an agenda. Just admit it. It's an eloquent and beautiful film that is honest about American shortcomings, but not in a hateful way. Someone said Ken Burns is horrid. The worst part is that scene where old Moonlight and Magnolias himself, Shelby Foote, nearly wets himself swinging Patton's Confederate grandfather's sword when some old lady descendant gives him permission.
Jesus.
And someone corrected, and that was General Forrest's sword. But I think we have that to look forward to. Shelby Foote swings a sword at some point.
Okay, that sounds fun.
And then someone else says Ken Burns favored the Yankees. So
there is no agreement in this comment section about whether Ken Burns is too pro-Southern, too pro-Confederate, or a ridiculously revisionist anti-American.
He does work for public broadcasting. That's government ownership.
Yeah, that's true.
They seize the means of television production.
That's a good point.
Diane makes a really good summary that I think is a good place to end on, even though there are loads more comments. I'll scroll through, maybe as you get us into the episode. But Diane says, Ken Burns brought the Civil War out from dusty library books and ignited thousands to learn about what happened, and not just a few well-known generals. Thank you, Ken Burns, for all the stories you have given us about American history and culture. And I think that's probably a good place to end it, because most of it, it just goes on with what we've already discussed.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, that's a great little dive into some of the discussions that people have had about Ken Burns' since our last episode, and
Mm-hmm.
that brings us into the episode that we watched for today, which is episode 2, A
Mm-hmm.
Bloody Affair. Picking up the
It takes
story.
us to Britain.
What's that?
It takes us to Britain. It's a bloody affair.
That's all right. Yep. It was weird that David McCullough was speaking in a British accent for the entire episode in his narration.
Yeah, I
but...
think maybe Ken Burns was still nervous about giving him direction.
Right. Right.
I think that's corrected by the second one. He kind of got his Dick Van Dyke Cockney accent going.
That's right. Let's talk a little bit about what worked effectively in this episode. Sam, you said that you liked this one a lot more than the first one. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I definitely did. I think a lot of the first episode, part of what I didn't like about kind of it felt very meandering, the first episode, and I think that was, it was intended to be sort of a prologue for the war.
Sure.
Even though by the end we did actually get into some of the fighting.
And it was a broad scope in the last episode, too.
Yeah, it was laying the groundwork for a lot of ideas that will presumably come up at various points in the series. But it felt like it was just kind of, we're going to zoom in and get a quote from this person, and then we're going to zoom in and get a quote from this person. This one felt like there was much more of a narrative. There were characters that came up throughout the entire piece that contributed to the narrative. There was more of a through line, whereas in the last one was definitely laying the groundwork, but, part of a prologue is to engage you in the story and to get you interested for the things to come. And when that is meandering, I was certainly braced for all 9 episodes to be rather meandering. But this one was much more engaged. It got into some of the internal politics within the Union. It got into a lot of the naval warfare that was happening, which I think is an often overlooked part of the Civil War by the masses.
The masses.
So the public is what I mean to say. I wasn't sure. So there was something up with my player when I initially started watching this one, and I thought, wait, because it started with the story about the guy with the.
That happened to me too. Yeah.
It began in my backyard and ended in my front parlor.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, is it like the same intro? Is this like Josh Brolin with Mankind, where it's the same kind of monologue at the beginning every time? But then it kept going, and it was all the same. And then I said, well, I thought I clicked on the second episode. And so I was like, maybe like 3 minutes, and it's like, well, let's just try this again. And sure enough, it was just playing the first episode again. I honestly wasn't sure, though, if it just like, okay, maybe every episode like starts the same and then but no, it was just playing the wrong episode. So, okay, I'm glad to hear that wasn't just me.
Yes. Well, we start. So what you found out then is that the episode does in fact start with
a different thing, which is the sort of unofficial anthem of the Union during the Civil War. Mm-hmm.
The Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yes.
And it was
one of my favorite songs. Just genuinely, it's a very stirring song, and whether it's Battle Hymn of the Republic or John Brown's Body or any of the many different lyrics that have been given to this song, I just find it very stirring and very motivational to sing. If I gotta psych myself up, that's a good thing to do it.
Yeah, and it gets into one of the ideas of this episode is the sort of shifting moral power of the war in as we get through the second year of the Civil War. It becomes a spiritually charged affair as the body count rises, as the bloodshed covers more and more of the country, and as people like Frederick Douglass increasingly push it towards becoming, for the Union, a referendum on the future of slavery. And
right.
That's absolutely encapsulated in the lines of the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's an effective way to start the episode. And it's also, of course, a
Yes.
reminder back to John Brown, um, who is always, I always love being reminded of, and is efficient at centering the idea that, this is a very spiritual reckoning moment. This is a moment of, you know, moral conflict and serious violence, which was moral
Yeah.
conflict and serious violence were kind of John Brown's two favorite things. Um, so it's a great introduction to the episode.
Yeah, yeah, I thought this episode did a really good job. I thought the depiction of black activists and white abolitionists kind of butting up against Lincoln's unionism was very appropriately portrayed. I thought it did a really good job of making it clear that Lincoln did was not trying to make the slavery the issue of the war. He was primarily trying to keep the Union together, and that was made very clear in this episode. But then there were soldiers, there were black activists, there were white abolitionists who were trying to make it about slavery, and I thought that dynamic was really good. Overall, the politics depicted I thought were really well done and very engaging. But I did notice it was primarily based in the Union.
Mm,
I'm interested to see whether we'll get more of the political realities of the Confederacy
yeah,
next time. Um,
yeah, you're right.
because in this episode anyway, and I guess you could interpret it several ways. You could interpret it more of, oh, this is just a Yankee story, but to me, then that doesn't show a bias. It just means you're not really telling the. It's a different kind of bias. It just means you're not telling the Confederate side. It's more that the details. It made very clear all of the human and mortal blunders of the Union leadership and the Union soldiers, but any of the details shared about the Confederacy, primarily, I'm thinking of Nathan Bedford Forrest's escape from, I believe, it was the Battle of Shiloh that Shelby Foote shares, was very mythic almost. The Confederate forces were set up more as legends or the great. Uh, Faking having more troops there
Yeah,
than were actually present. All of the You didn't hear a lot of the internal squabbling or concerns or struggles of the Confederate Army like you did the Union Army in
right.
this episode. So I'm curious. I'm curious whether we'll get that in
We
future
haven't gotten
episodes.
into the nitty gritty of internal politics in the Confederate States of America, which
Mm,
I think you're absolutely right to point out is, well, yeah, we'll see if we get there. Hopefully we do.
mm-hmm,
So far, two episodes in, I hope we get a look at how the people trying to create a new nation state in the middle of a war uh, get
mm-hmm.
into that. And there's a little bit of a discussion of there's some level of that in this episode. You'll remember there's discussion of the imposition of the draft in the Confederate States
Yes.
and the
Yes.
resultant, kind of furor about it. After all, it's the national government imposing a draft on the states, um, and
Yes.
it's seen as
Yep.
a
I made note of that.
yeah, it's a pretty
The
broad.
Confederacy. Yeah, they took federal control
Yes,
except for wealthy slave owners.
right. Yeah, yeah. There's always that exception to be sure. But I
Mm-hmm.
hope we get into some of the other ways that the Confederate state, as it tries to do something really, I think we forget often that it's a remarkable project in its ambition in terms of creating an entirely new country,
Mm-hmm.
asserting its own legitimacy, establishing institutions of governance in the middle of a war, uh, trying to maintain a war state, win a war, and construct institutions of governance all at the same time, amidst
Mm-hmm.
personal squabbles, amidst the fact that this state is based on uh, keeping at least 4 million people explicitly outside of the bounds of citizenship and assuming that their actions will not matter at all. And the book Confederate Reckoning by Stephanie McCurry makes a great point. This is also true in the Union, of course, but in the Confederacy, it especially ends up mattering that half of the population of human beings, women, were still, of course, not included in the political citizenry either. But both the 4 million enslaved people and the disenfranchised women who, because of the draft, many of their husbands will be sent off to the war. Both of these groups will have an effect on the Confederacy in profound ways. So I hope we get
Right.
into some of the internal politics of the Confederacy and the on the ground, city by city, person by person, home front, and on the plantation
Hmm.
lives of people living within the Confederacy. I assume we'll get there. We haven't gotten there quite yet.
Right. Right. I thought one thing that was really interesting, and I think this was interesting because I already have, a decent understanding of the war, was when Burns went through the chain of command all the way up,
Yeah.
um, from the commander in chief down to a private in the army. I thought that was really interesting, but again, that's another thing that I think it's interesting if you already know some of the players involved. Um, I don't think it'd be very interesting if the name, McClellan meant as much to you as any private in the army. Um, so if you're just learning about the war, I'm not sure if the chain of command is going to be super engaging, but it does help to illustrate some of the internal kind of the impact that the politics had on the internal politics between different generals, different commanders, um, had on the war effort. And part of that is Lincoln was very slow to fire people in his cabinet, McClellan especially, who did not act very very at all. Um, but there were awful casualties that went along with everything, and we're doing much less of a breakdown of the war, but just so we're at, a lot of this episode is devoted to the Battle of Shiloh, which I thought was depicted very well. I thought the use of photographs and paintings worked really well for that and for the naval battles.
Yeah.
So the visual depictions, I mean, I think they worked for me. Um, Again, I would mention that Forrest's exit was presented kind of without challenge. Like, uh, again, it's a fine line of, okay, telling us about Jefferson Davis, cutting roses in his garden. Does that do too much to lean into whatever sort of mythic narrative we want to create by choosing to include that? Is including Forrest's dramatic exit, pulling up a Union soldier to use as a human shield and then tossing him back on the ground once you get away? Is that helping the narrative? Is that helping the understanding of the war? What's the cost benefit of including details like that? Because it might stick in your head more. But and I know we're not at this point in history, but I would have a hard time mentioning Forrest without once mentioning the KKK. When it's pretty explicit where his views are on the fight, and that's where I kind of struggled. And again, Shelby Foote, I believe, is the only historian in this episode. And he shared an anecdote from a low-ranking Confederate who came across the Union. And they asked why he's fighting, because he didn't own any slaves, and he said, "I'm fighting because you're here." Um, which, yeah, again, it's unchallenged. Anecdotes like that, unchallenged, I think present difficulty when you're trying to give a nuanced and full argument. And when you have, 9 full-length episodes to tell it, you can afford to have a little nuance. Um, and I was disappointed that wasn't challenged more. Because obviously the Union troops are there because Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, because they declared war on the United States. Um, and I struggled with some of the unchallenged anecdotes that were given,
Sure.
and not just from Shelby Foote, but from some of the historical figures as well. and I'm fully aware that there's a bias, and that's part of my I have biases, and that's part of what I struggle with. Ken Burns being that detached narrator is everyone has a bias. You can try to counter it as much as you can, but then that in itself is slanting your work in particular directions.
Sure.
So I guess I would feel better if I knew more about Shelby Foote or I knew more about Ken Burns, if I knew the perspective that they were taking this from. There's no such thing as a purely historical, purely objective perspective. That is non-existent. Um, and I prefer history when we're aware of where everyone's coming from, because I think that makes, to me, that brings the conversation to be more interesting, but also in better faith. So there's my rant on that. Shelby Foote's got a good mustache, though. I'm going to go through the facial hair. I have facial hair reviews for a lot of the big players in this episode.
Yeah.
I don't talk about Lincoln at all because that's kind of been done to death. But I've got a facial hair roundup at the end that I think you'll be anxious to hear.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I'll respond
Mm-hmm.
to some of the interesting points that you brought up, Sam, and especially things like, do we have a responsibility to bring up the KKK every time we talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest, for example? I assume that it will come up at some point in this series, for sure. Um, Perhaps it won't. I I we'll just have to find out. Um,
And that's putting a lot of faith in the audience that they're going to watch 10 hours of this.
sure, yeah. But it definitely, the level of myth making is also, is it once you start looking for little pieces of slight editorializing, it becomes,
Mm-hmm.
you can pick it up. For example, I'm thinking of one moment where, and you don't have to lie, you don't have to obscure anything in order to like cross a line from what you're doing is purely like bland historical facts into you're telling a story. And one of those moments that struck me is a moment when we talk about a thin Union line that's holding the advance. And David McCullough's narration informs us very briefly that they're mostly, I think, Wisconsin and Ohio farm boys. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an instance where you get something that is factually true. Um, it is not obscuring anything, but it's a really effective piece of almost myth making
Mm-hmm.
because there are a lot of facts about this group of individuals. You could say their average height. You could say the color of their
Yeah.
uniforms. You could say what most of them had eaten that day. Like I obviously saying their average height in that moment would have been a lot less interesting. Would have been a lot less engaging. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the impulse of a storyteller is to find facts that make the best story, that connect the audience with characters in the most interesting way. And sometimes, perhaps a lot of the time, that will conform alongside your ideological biases or whatever persuasive argument you as a filmmaker are trying to make. And sometimes it might mean that you follow that impulse for storytelling too far. It might mean that you follow it uh, to a place that you hadn't fully considered the ramifications of. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's really interesting to try and note that in some ways, I think for a storyteller like Ken Burns, that is the relationship to facts and context, is to find the facts and the context that are like most suitable for a compelling narrative. And I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it ends up being, part of something like the lost cause narrative, unfortunately. and sometimes it's
advertently or inadvertently.
often inadvertently, and sometimes it's for more benign reasons. But it should always.
Mm-hmm.
But the main thing for an audience member is to be aware that a documentarian and storyteller is coming from that perspective. And so, anytime you notice a situation like the Wisconsin and Ohio farm boys, try and think critically about why this kind of fact is being presented as part of the story rather than some other fact. Whether, and you could very well conclude that it's for a very benign reason, or it might open you up to think about what's being told in a different way. So that's that.
Yeah.
There's a thought on that. Are we ready for the beards?
Yeah.
Or do you have something else to say?
Almost.
Okay.
You know, just a few other things, but
Yeah.
I think you make a great point that then I think the best filmmakers or the best documentary producers or the best history communicators will make that balancing of why facts are included so evident or so natural in the storytelling that it doesn't have to be okay, wait, pause, think about it, now we can go forward.
Sure.
To me, the best documentaries are the ones where the pieces fall into place on their own, where it all fits together, and that's not easy to do. It might be impossible to do.
Yeah.
But to me, that's where the critical assessment should be part of the viewing experience and not an added effort on top of the viewing experience.
Okay, sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, but I really enjoyed the on-the-ground details. I really enjoyed learning more about the different camps. Again, I felt like there was more focus on what life was like at Union camps and things like that. And one phrase I really loved, tedium punctuated with terror.
Yeah.
That's one thing we haven't talked about, is when there is a lot of good writing with the narration in this. And there's some really beautiful stuff. I wasn't fully, cognizant of the relationship between Grant and Sherman. I enjoyed learning more about that and the conflict between Grant and other generals. Like, again, the anecdote that a rival of Grant's began the rumors about his alcoholism.
Right.
By sharing that fact or that piece of information and not sharing, but there might be other sources, but there might be this reason. By only mentioning that, the only thing that I remember is, or will retain from this is, oh, well, it's not true that Grant was, a drunk or anything like that, when there's still historical debate about it. And presumably just showing the single perspective might not be the incorrect perspective, that it was all overblown by a peer. But again, that's where that one piece can be. He chose to include that detail rather than other details, and that leans the viewer in different directions. All the talk about technology worked really well. Talking about the rifle musket, talking about the monitor.
Yeah.
I thought was really, really interesting. And again, I really enjoyed hearing about the internal tactics and the political fray within the Union. And I hope we get more of the Union stuff, but also getting into more of the Confederacy. Because as a Yankee boy myself, in Minnesota, we mostly hear about the Union side. I'd be interested to hear more about the internal politics and pressures of the of the Confederacy.
Yeah, I hope we get into that.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to say just one. I think you're totally right to bring up the both the point about Grant's alcoholism and the relationship between Grant and Sherman. I think that's, and we'll see where Ken Burns takes it from here. But again, it's an example of, for example, calling Sherman's mental breakdown and like deep depression that he felt very early on in the war, using the contemporary term for it of melancholy, is I get the impulse for that, and I think there are benefits to it, but I don't know. There comes a point when you watch a thing where you run the risk of just like criticizing
meaningless
meaningless criticism of the documentary that you wish they had made instead of the one they actually did make. But there's such an interesting thing between Grant's genuine struggles with alcohol and Sherman's bouts of depression, and that these men have serious struggles internally, that they share with each other, and
Right.
is I hope we get into the friendship of Grant and Sherman more, because like you, Sam, I found it it's certainly one of the most interesting parts of the character side of the Civil War, and I hope we get more into it, and I hope we get into the nitty gritty of it.
Yeah. I made a note about Sherman's melancholy as well. I read a book a few years back called Lincoln's Melancholy,
Yeah.
and it spoke about Lincoln's mental health issues. And I mentioned this in the last episode. The War for the Common Soldier also talked about the mental health
Yeah.
problems of obviously that soldiers of all eras face, and specifically the issues that the Civil War soldiers face, and how they had to put a kind of a brave face on their letters back home and things
Right.
like that, and that can be used again by modern historians to make it a splendid little war sort of depiction. Because see, look at how happy they were. It was all good. When our word for clinically depressed, the closest thing would be melancholy.
Yeah.
But there's also the danger, and the book Lincoln's Melancholy did a really good job of explaining, okay, what is historically responsible here. Obviously, they cannot sit down with Lincoln and diagnose him with anything.
Right.
But is it more responsible to say, okay, we have this evidence that he would be diagnosed with this, or but the alternative of saying we can confidently say this is saying we think we can say this, but we're not sure. And that's not very satisfying for consumers.
Right.
To say we're pretty sure, but we're not sure. And that's just not as satisfying. So the simple solution is to go with saying melancholy.
Right.
But then it can be so brushed over by a 1990 audience. Anyway, all the talk about Sherman and Grant and everyone brings us to the discussion of facial hair. There's good stuff. There's bad stuff. Mostly I'm talking about the leaders that came up. Most of the privates that we saw were all fresh-faced, clean-shaven.
Right.
The first note I have is McClellan. I don't think I've properly appreciated McClellan's mustache.
He does have a very nice little mustache, yeah.
It's a nice mustache, and he probably has plenty of time to deal with it because he isn't fighting. Stanton, I love his look. He's got the beard, the glasses.
He's got a big,
just
powerful beard, right? He's a very Santa figure.
Just incredible. And I believe he keeps it. I don't know if he shaved it after he was stabbed a bunch.
I think he keeps it, yeah.
I thought so. But the great look there. Wasn't Jeff Davis's best picture? It didn't show off the facial hair.
Jeff Davis, yeah.
Yeah. There have been other. I wouldn't say I like Jeff Davis's facial hair, but I can at least respect that about him. Mostly just that.
Yeah.
But the picture there didn't portray the facial hair very well. I don't really have feelings on Lincoln. I feel like I can't look at that. I don't know how you can really form an opinion on it.
Because it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's just it's ubiquitous. I don't really have any feelings about Forrest's look. I kind of look just kind of dirty.
Yeah.
But it wasn't an especially strong beard, and he didn't balance it out with very good hair. It just wasn't
right. It's
very well kept together.
It's kind of the goatee with the mustache, very strong on the goatee. And I don't know, for some people can pull that off, and I think you're right that he needed a different hairstyle to balance that out.
Yeah, maybe shorter up top, but then again, he spends most of his time under a hood,
right?
So probably doesn't need anything like that.
Right.
I talked earlier about making my biases known.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, you did.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Sherman, I could go either way. Feel like he's just being Grant's puppy. But it's solid.
It's a great
he's got
beard.
Good coverage. But
it's a great beard.
Yeah.
But you're right.
I guess that yes, it would be Sherman, but then we would cut to an image
right
of U.S. Grant.
Yeah.
And what a smoke show.
It really is.
This might be one of the first times I'm publicly saying this, but Ulysses S. Grant at any age is our hottest president.
He's
Just-
up there. He's got great coverage on the
he
beard.
is-
It's very impressive.
He's got great hair. He's got great beard. His eyes are just. He's just. I think he's a beautiful, beautiful man.
I thought this little ranking thing was only about beards, and you appear to have a much more holistic view here. But
Oh, yes. Well, Grant's beard is the best beard because it's on the best man.
all right, I see.
And I'm not even fully kidding right now. Like
I know you
I
aren't.
look at I look at a portrait or I look at a picture of Grant, and it's just it takes my breath away momentarily. Like I can't read his biography for too long
Oh,
because
Jesus.
he's just a very handsome guy, and I think we get all lost in the Kennedys and
So for
I don't know,
listeners,
who else do people find attractive?
like we said, Sam is really sticks to his guns in terms of he does believe that he should make his biases known, and you're getting it pretty much straight from the hip here on that.
Yeah.
And so thank you for that, Sam. It's
Of course.
I think I generally agree with you on your choices, although I would put in a word for William Howard Taft as the hottest president, but
of course you would.
and
I respect the facial hair there. You know,
Yeah.
there's a difference between respect for facial hair and thinking someone is beautiful. I think Ulysses S. Grant is beautiful.
Taft has the confidence, which is the most important trait for attractiveness.
I'm sorry. He's a sensitive man. He's in tune with his feelings. He will express them, and he'll work through them. He has up days and he has down days, but he is a whole man.
All right, this is something you need to work through on your own. But
I think the listeners will back me up on this.
Okay,
I am going to find the best image I have
okay.
of Grant for the thumbnail for this video,
That's a good idea. Well, we'll have people sound off
and
in the
not
comments.
one I made myself.
All right, yeah. All right, well, folks, I think that
I
ends.
wish I were joking here. I wish this was a bit.
I
but,
think we're
it
going
really
to end our
isn't.
discussion here today, and I don't really know the best way to wrap this up, but
Yeah. Okay, so you do that, but Logan, just another thing about no, we don't need to play the music. I really need to get into it.
We can end it here.